Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. After only a little break, today's video is on the Core Ultra 7 155H and its integrated ARC graphics. So, without further ado, let's get started. To start, let's talk about the 155H. Launching on the 14th of December 2023, this chip, built on a 7nm process, contains 16 cores, which are laid out with 6 performance cores, 8 efficiency cores, and 2 low power efficiency cores. The CPU has a base clock on the P cores of 1.4 GHz and a boost of 4.8 GHz. The E cores have a base of 0.9 GHz and a boost of 3.8 GHz. And lastly, the low power E cores have a base of 0.7 GHz and a boost of up to 2.5 GHz. For the cache, this CPU has 24 MB of shared level 3 cache, and the rest will be up on screen now. Along with that, this CPU has a 20 watt TDP with a maximum power draw of 115 watts. Now, moving on to this chip's GPU, it contains 128 Arc Alchemist low power graphics cores with a boost clock of 2250 MHz and a base clock of 300 MHz. It also contains 1024 shader units, 64 TMUs, 32 ROPs, and 128 execution units. It also supports DirectX 12 Ultimate and Vulkan 1.4. Now, moving on to our test bench, we will be using an MSI Modern 15H AI C1M with a 512GB Micron 2400 NVMe SSD and 24 gigs of DDR5 clocked at 5600 megatransfers a second. Now, moving on from our system, let's get into the benchmarks. So, let's start with Fortnite. All my main runs were done with DirectX 12 and TAA. So, to start, at 1080p medium performance mode, we saw an average of 78 frames a second with 1% lows of 36, and at 1080p medium, we saw an average of 33 frames a second with 1% lows of 17. And lastly, at 1080p epic, we saw an average of 21 FPS with 1% lows of 3. Now, at 1440p performance mode, we saw an average of 59 frames a second with 1% lows of 31. At 1440p medium, we saw an average of 19 frames a second with 1% lows of 2. And at 1440p epic, we saw an average of 9 frames a second with 1% lows of 3. The GPU bottleneck we see here is just atrocious, with especially the 1440p medium results here being very depressing. Now, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 2023. Well, this was pretty bad to say the least. At 1080p balanced, we saw an average of 30 frames a second with 1% lows of 14, and at 1080p Ultra, we saw an average of 23 frames a second with 1% lows of 10. Then, at 1440p balanced, we saw an average of 22 frames a second with 1% lows of 9, and at 1440p Ultra, we saw an average of 15 frames a second with 1% lows of 5. Moving on to CS2, here we really get to see the CPU finally stretch its legs. So, at 1080p medium we saw an average of 74 frames a second with 1% lows of 37, and at 1080p very high we saw an average of 31 frames a second with 1% lows of 12. At 1440p medium we saw an average of 52 frames a second with 1% lows of 26, and at 1440p very high we saw an average of 19 frames a second with 1% lows of 11. Here, we see good enough performance from our IGPU and CPU. While the 1440p very high results still show a GPU bottleneck, the 1080p medium and 1440p medium show off the power of our CPU. Now, for Cyberpunk I chose to do a single run with ray tracing set to low to see how our GPU handles ray tracing. To start, at 1080p medium we saw an average of 30 frames a second with 1% lows of 17, at 1080p Ultra we saw an average of 22 frames a second with 1% lows of 12, and lastly at 1080p low ray tracing we saw an average of 21 frames a second with 1% lows of 5. Now, at 1440p medium we saw an average of 23 frames a second with 1% lows of 13, at 1440p Ultra we saw an average of 15 frames a second with 1% lows of 2, and lastly at 1440p low ray tracing we saw an average of 17 frames a second with 1% lows of 7. I'll be honest, this game isn't really playable at any of these. And it's worse that the game automatically turns on upscaling as well when you select the preset, so I can't imagine what general raster is like. Okay, so with Helldivers, at 1080p medium, with textures on medium, we saw an average of 21 frames a second, 1% lows of 18. At 1080p Ultra plus Ultra textures, we saw an average of 15 frames a second, 1% lows of 13. And at 1440p medium and medium textures, we saw an average of 14 frames a second, 1% lows of 12. And at 1440p Ultra and Ultra textures, we saw an average of 10 frames a second, 1% lows of 0. One thing I have to mention is that the 1440p Ultra was bad enough, but the worst thing is the animations weren't even properly working on nearly anything. I personally believe this might just be Arc Alchemist doing Arc Alchemist stuff as it always has. Now, with Battlefield 6, I'm gonna be honest, this isn't even playable. Looking back, I probably should have done a run on low as well, but you can't change the past, so I'll give the numbers here now. At 1080p medium, we saw an average of 18 frames a second with 1% lows of 15. At 1080p Ultra, we saw an average of 13 frames a second with 1% lows of 7. At 1440p medium, we saw an average of 12 frames a second with 1% lows of 7. And at 1440p Ultra, we saw an average of 9 frames a second with 1% lows of 7 as well. Again, I think I blame most of these poor results down to our IGPU, as during this entire time, the CPU was doing very well when it came to usage. Okay, so now moving on to hat in time. At 1080p performance, we saw an average of 65 frames a second with 1% lows of 44. At 1080p very high, we saw an average of 46 frames a second with 1% lows of 32. At 1440p performance, we saw an average of 48 frames a second with 1% lows of 35. And lastly, at 1440p very high, we saw an average of 33 frames a second with 1% lows of 21. For Crusader Kings 3, I ran the game at speed 4 so to keep all the results in line. So, at 1080p medium we saw an average of 43 frames a second with 1% lows of 13. At 1080p Ultra we saw an average of 19 frames a second with 1% lows of 3. At 1440p medium we saw an average of 31 frames a second with 1% lows of 6. And lastly, at 1440p Ultra we saw an average of 12 frames a second with 1% lows of 3. Now, for Forza Horizons 4, at 1080p medium we saw an average of 59 frames a second with 1% lows of 37. At 1080p Ultra we saw an average of 45 frames a second with 1% lows of 30. At 1440p medium we saw an average of 43 frames a second with 1% lows of 23. And at 1440p Ultra we saw an average of 31 frames a second with 1% lows of 18. So, with Ryu, Jinx and Mario Kart 8, I'm just going to shove the settings up on screen so I don't have to read them. And at 1080p we saw an average of 59 frames a second with 1% lows of 25. And at 1440p we saw an average of 50 frames a second with 1% lows of 22. I also did want to test RPCS3, but it kept crashing on me and gave me weird visual artifacting on game surfaces. Stuff I've experienced before with Arc GPUs and RPCS3. Now, for our 3 synthetic benchmarks. On Cinebench R23, we saw a single core score of 1815 and a multi-core score of 9932. With the Blender benchmark, I'm just going to shove the results up on screen so I don't have to read them. So, on Firmark at 1080p we got 1318 points with an average FPS of 22, and at 1440p using Vulkan we got 935 points with an average FPS of 15. My final thoughts on the chip. Overall, while none of the results are great, I'd say in most games you could probably lower the settings and get a bit better performance. The big flaw of the 155H is its weak IGPU. In games where we are CPU bound like CS2 and Fortnite on performance mode, we can see just how well the CPU can do when it's allowed to stretch its legs. But in games like Battlefield 6 and Helldivers 2, when it's very GPU bound, we see the performance absolutely crash. I'd say if you're looking at the CPU, I wouldn't spend more than €650 on a laptop containing only it. But I do have to say it is fairly good. Now, I'm not reviewing the laptop, so I can't give an exact battery life number, but I can get about 4 hours out of mine while playing games like Minecraft or Hearts of Iron 4. But we do have to remember the elephant in the room. Panther Lake or Intel Core Ultra 300 absolutely demolishes this chip on all fronts. Single core, multi-core, and battery life, along with the GPU as well. And I have to say personally, if you're looking between this and a Panther Lake chip, just pick the Panther Lake chip. I do like the 155H, especially on multi-core workloads, but Panther Lake is just that much better from the results we've seen from it. So, sorry for the delay. I'm gonna be honest, I started benchmarking the GTX 950 and kinda got lazy halfway through and moved on to do other stuff. I'm a natural procrastinator, so obviously by the time December rolls around and I'm ready to finish benchmarking it, my brother's PC dies and I have to give him a lend to my test bench for a few weeks while we wait for Ramageddon to end so he can build a new PC. Obviously, as we see now, it didn't end, it only got worse. So for the time being, I've decided to shelve the GTX 950 video and do something else. Because obviously my upload schedule is amazing. I'll have something else out probably around Easter, but I can't guarantee anything. If I don't have anything out around Easter, it'll be around June, July. Anyway, outside of that, thanks for watching and shalom before.